A boring history for sleep. The strangest royal scandals. You never heard of the rain. Tapped gently against the windows of the Boston University Library's archive room as Michael Bennett adjusted his glasses and squinted at the faded text before him. Outside, the autumn leaves swirled across the campus grounds, but Michael had long since lost track of time. The soft yellow light of his desk lamp cast long shadows across stacks of dusty manuscripts and leather-bound journals. At 32, Michael was the youngest associate professor in the university's history department, a distinction that brought both pride and pressure. His specialization in monarchical systems and court politics had earned him respect among his peers. But his latest project was proving to be more challenging and far more intriguing than he had anticipated. "Professor Bennett, we're closing in 15 minutes, called Ms. Winters, the elderly archivist whose dedication to the university's historical collection was legendary. Michael looked up, momentarily disoriented. "Already? I could have sworn I just got here an hour ago." Ms. Winters smiled knowingly. "You've been saying that for the past 4 hours, Professor." "Same time tomorrow?" "Definitely," Michael nodded, carefully placing a bookmark in the fragile diary of Lady Elizabeth Cromwell, a distant relative of the infamous Lord Protector, whose personal accounts had somehow ended up in the university's collection. What had captured Michael's attention wasn't the political insights she offered. Those were well documented elsewhere, but rather her oblique references to what she called the Windsor affair, a scandal apparently so shocking that she dared not commit the details to paper, even in her private diary. As Michael gathered his notes, his phone buzzed with a text from his department chair, Professor Eleanor Hayes. "Committee approved your sabbatical. Congratulations. 6 months to find your royal skeletons. Make them count." A smile crossed Michael's face. The university had granted him a sabbatical to pursue his unconventional research project, documenting and analyzing the most obscure royal scandals throughout history, the ones that had been deliberately suppressed, hidden away in private collections, or mentioned only in coded language in personal correspondence. It wasn't the kind of academic pursuit that typically garnered funding, but Michael had made a compelling case that understanding how monarchies managed and contained scandals provided unique insights into the evolution of political power structures and public relations. The next morning, Michael sat in his modest apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts, sorting through his research materials and planning his approach. The walls of his living room were lined with bookshelves, and a large map of Europe was pinned to one wall, with colored pins marking locations of interest. His coffee had gone cold as he reviewed his preliminary findings, organizing them chronologically rather than by geography. "Let's see," he muttered to himself, a habit formed during years of solitary research. "I've got solid leads on the mysterious death of Prince Alexei of Russia that contradicts the official narrative, the secret marriage of King George IV before he took the throne, and whatever this Windsor affair is that Lady Elizabeth was so afraid to detail." He tapped his pen against a yellow legal pad. "But I need more, something substantial enough to justify 6 months of research." His laptop chimed with an incoming email. It was from Dr. Harriet Chen, curator of the Royal Historical Society's manuscript collection in London. Michael had reached out to her weeks ago about gaining access to their restricted archives. "Professor Bennett," the email began, "after careful consideration, the Society has agreed to grant you limited access to the sealed correspondence of Queen Victoria's Lady-in-Waiting, Lady Sarah Hamilton, which has remained restricted until now. As you suggested in your proposal, there are indications that Lady Hamilton was involved in managing several potentially damaging situations during her 40 years of service. However, we must insist on certain conditions." Michael read through the conditions. Standard confidentiality agreements, restrictions on photography, and requirements for the Society to review any publications arising from the research. But he barely registered them. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough he needed. Lady Hamilton had been known to be the Queen's most trusted confidant, and her position would have made her privy to every secret of the Victorian court. 3 weeks later, Michael found himself in London, the persistent drizzle and grey skies a stark contrast to the crisp New England autumn he had left behind. The imposing stone building that housed the Royal Historical Society loomed before him, its grandeur a fitting repository for the secrets it contained. Michael adjusted his tie, a formality he rarely bothered with at home, and climbed the steps with a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt since his doctoral dissertation defense. Dr. Chen met him in the marble-floored lobby. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with sharp eyes behind stylish glasses and an air of efficiency in her movements. "Professor Bennett, welcome to London," she said, extending her hand. "I hope your flight was uneventful. As uneventful as transatlantic flights ever are," Michael replied with a smile. "Thank you again for approving my request. I know how protective the Society is of its restricted collections." Dr. Chen led him through a series of corridors, each requiring a different security clearance. "We are protective for good reason," she said, as they waited for an elevator. "These aren't just historical documents. They're the private thoughts and actions of real people who never intended them to be public. Some of them have living descendants who still wield considerable influence." The implication was clear. Tread carefully. Michael nodded his understanding. The restricted archives were housed in a climate-controlled room in the basement, accessible only by a select few staff members. Dr. Chen used her keycard to admit them, and Michael was immediately struck by the silence, a deeper, more complete silence than even the hushed atmosphere of the university library. "Lady Hamilton's correspondence is in these 5 boxes." Dr. Chen indicated a set of acid-free archival containers on a reading table. "They've been organized chronologically. I've arranged for you to have access from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. I'll be your point of contact if you need anything. And Professor Bennett," she added, her tone becoming more serious, "while we've approved your research, the Society would appreciate discretion in how you frame your findings." After she left, Michael spent several minutes just looking at the boxes, aware of the weight of history they contained. Then, with the careful hands of an experienced researcher, he opened the first box and began his descent into the hidden world of Victorian court scandals. Lady Sarah Hamilton's handwriting was precise and elegant, her correspondence meticulously organized. Many letters were mundane, arrangements for royal appearances, notes about household management, and observations about court personalities. But by the 3rd day, Michael began to notice patterns in her language, phrases that seemed to recur when discussing certain sensitive matters. "The delicate situation has been addressed," she wrote in one letter to the Queen's private secretary. "The young gentleman in question has accepted a position in the colonial service, with generous compensation for his discretion. The letters have been secured." In another, "Lady M's indiscretion remains contained. Her husband has been persuaded that a season abroad would benefit her health, and arrangements have been made with the physician to support this recommendation." The true nature of these situations was never explicitly stated, but Michael's trained eye could read between the lines. He began to compile a dossier of these cryptic references, cross-referencing them with other historical records, official court appointments, sudden departures from London society, unexplained transfers to diplomatic posts in distant parts of the empire. A pattern emerged. Lady Hamilton had been instrumental in managing what appeared to be a systematic approach to scandal containment within the Victorian court. Her methods ranged from financial settlements and arranged marriages to strategic appointments in remote colonial outposts and carefully crafted cover stories for abrupt departures from society. As Michael delved deeper into Lady Hamilton's correspondence, he became particularly intrigued by repeated references to someone she called the American cousin, and a situation she described only as the Baltimore incident. This appeared to be one of the most serious matters she handled, involving multiple letters exchanged with a law firm in Baltimore and several urgent telegrams to and from the British consul there. On his second week in London, Michael decided to follow this lead. He contacted the Maryland Historical Society to inquire about any records they might have related to British diplomatic activities in Baltimore during the specific time frame he had identified from Lady Hamilton's correspondence. The response came within days. "Professor Bennett, we have identified several items that may be relevant to your inquiry, including the private papers of Judge William Thornton, who served on the circuit court during the period in question. His papers include correspondence with British officials regarding an unnamed legal matter. These materials are not restricted and can be made available to you." Michael booked a flight to Baltimore for the following weekend. The research was taking him down an unexpected path, but that was the nature of historical inquiry. You followed the evidence wherever it led. The Maryland Historical Society was housed in a stately red brick building in Baltimore's Mount Vernon neighborhood. Unlike the imposing grandeur of the Royal Historical Society, it had a more welcoming, accessible atmosphere. The archivist who greeted Michael, a grey-haired man named Robert Dalton, seemed genuinely excited about Michael's research. "Not many people ask about Judge Thornton's papers," he said, as he led Michael to a research room. "Most historians are more interested in the Civil War materials or the maritime history collections. But Thornton was a fascinating character, Harvard-educated, well-connected in both American and European society. His wife was from an old Philadelphia family with strong ties to British aristocracy. The judge's papers were contained in just 2 boxes, considerably less material than Lady Hamilton's extensive correspondence. Michael started with the letters dated within the time frame he had identified from the London archives. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. A series of letters between Judge Thornton and a Sir Robert Cavendish, identified as a legal attaché to the British consulate, discussed arrangements for a private hearing to be conducted without public record. "The young lady's identity must be protected at all costs," Cavendish wrote. "Her connection to certain persons of prominence in London society would create an international sensation if revealed. The Crown is prepared to be most generous in ensuring all parties maintain absolute discretion." Judge Thornton's reply was cautious but accommodating. "While such an arrangement is highly irregular, I recognize the sensitive nature of the situation. I will hear the matter in my private chambers with only essential personnel present. However, I must insist that the young lady's rights under American law be fully respected, regardless of the influence of her British connections." Further correspondence revealed that the case involved a young woman, identified only as Miss W., who had made certain claims against a gentleman of the highest standing in British society. Indeed, the nature of these claims was never explicitly stated, but the intensity of the British concern and the extraordinary measures taken to keep the matter private suggested a scandal of significant proportions. Michael's excitement grew as he pieced together the narrative. The Baltimore incident appeared to involve a young American woman who had somehow crossed paths with a member of the British aristocracy, perhaps even royalty, resulting in a situation so potentially damaging that Queen Victoria's most trusted lady-in-waiting had personally overseen its resolution. The final letter in the sequence, from Cavendish to Thornton, expressed profound gratitude for your discretion and wisdom in resolving this most delicate matter, and mentioned that arrangements have been made for Miss W's comfortable establishment in San Francisco, where she will have ample opportunity to make a fresh start, far from curious eyes. Michael sat back, his mind racing. What had happened in Baltimore? Who was Miss W, and who was the British gentleman she had accused, and why had it been necessary to relocate her across the continent? The correspondence provided tantalizing hints, but no definitive answers. That evening, in his hotel room overlooking Baltimore's inner harbor, Michael called Dr. Harriet Chen in London. "Doctor, Chen, I've found something in Baltimore that connects directly to Lady Hamilton's correspondence, he explained after exchanging pleasantries. There was clearly some kind of legal proceeding involving a British aristocrat and an American woman. But I'm missing key details. Would the Society have any records from the British consulate in Baltimore during that period? Dr. Chen's response was measured. The diplomatic archives would be in the Foreign Office records at the National Archives in Kew, not in our collection. However, she paused. There is one other possibility. Lady Hamilton kept a personal diary that is separate from her official correspondence. It's even more restricted than the materials you've already accessed. It would require special approval from the board. How quickly could that approval be granted? Michael asked, trying to keep the eagerness from his voice. It would be unusual, but given your current clearance and the specific nature of your research, perhaps within a week. I'll see what I can do. While waiting for approval to access Lady Hamilton's diary, Michael decided to pursue another angle. The reference to Miss W's relocation to San Francisco provided a new lead. He contacted the California Historical Society to inquire about any records they might have of British expatriates or recent arrivals from the East Coast during the relevant time period. The Society's records yielded a promising lead. A Miss Elizabeth Wilson had arrived in San Francisco shortly after the Baltimore proceedings, purchased a substantial property in Nob Hill with funds from an unidentified source, and established herself in local society. Census records indicated she was born in Maryland, but had no family connections listed. More intriguingly, she never married, but adopted a young girl a few years after her arrival, unusual for a single woman in that era. Michael's research was temporarily interrupted by a call from his department chair at Boston University. "Michael, how's the sabbatical going?" Professor Hayes asked. "The dean was asking about your progress. Apparently, some of the board members are questioning the value of researching royal scandals. They're concerned it might seem sensationalistic." Michael sighed. "The academic politics never stopped, even when you were thousands of miles away. Eleanor, what I'm uncovering goes far beyond sensationalism. I'm documenting systematic methods of scandal management that shaped public perception of monarchy for generations. This isn't about exposing salacious details. It's about understanding how power structures protect themselves and control their public narrative." "I know that, and you know that," Eleanor replied. "But you might need to frame it more explicitly in your next progress report. Maybe emphasize the institutional analysis aspect rather than the scandal element." After promising to adjust his reporting approach, Michael returned to his research. The approval from the Royal Historical Society came through more quickly than expected. Dr. Chen had advocated effectively on his behalf, and he was soon on a plane back to London. Lady Hamilton's personal diary proved to be the key that unlocked the mystery. Unlike her official correspondence, where she was always careful and circumspect, in her private writings she was remarkably candid. "The Baltimore matter is finally resolved," she wrote in an entry dated June 1878. "Such a sordid business from start to finish. That HRH could be so reckless as to form an attachment with an American during his naval tour, and then to father a child. The girl was remarkably sensible, considering her youth and circumstances. She accepted the settlement without excessive demands, though Judge Thornton was tiresome about ensuring the arrangement was fair by American standards. The child has been placed with a suitable family in Devon, with a cover story about being the orphaned daughter of distant relations. No connection to its true parentage will ever be established. The mother will remain in California, well compensated for her cooperation and silence." Michael stared at the page, his heart racing. HRH, His Royal Highness. Lady Hamilton was referring to a British prince who had fathered an illegitimate child with an American woman during a naval tour. The time frame narrowed the possibilities considerably. It could only be Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, Queen Victoria's second son, who had served in the Royal Navy and visited the United States during the period in question. The implications were staggering. A direct member of the British royal family had fathered an illegitimate child with an American woman, a potential scandal of enormous proportions in Victorian England. The child had been taken from its mother and raised in England under a false identity, while the mother had been effectively exiled to the opposite coast of America, bought off with a substantial settlement. As Michael continued reading Lady Hamilton's diary, he discovered that this was far from the only royal scandal she had managed. There were references to a Scottish indiscretion involving the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, a Mediterranean affair concerning Princess Louise, and numerous incidents involving lesser members of the aristocracy who were connected to the royal family. The diary revealed that Lady Hamilton had developed an extensive network of loyal operatives, physicians who could be trusted to provide convenient medical justifications for sudden trips abroad, lawyers who could create airtight settlements and financial arrangements, and society hostesses who could smooth the way for necessary marriages or help integrate relocated individuals into new social circles. Michael was fascinated by the sophistication of this system. It wasn't simply about covering up scandals after they occurred. It was a proactive approach to reputation management that anticipated problems and neutralized them before they could become public. In many ways, Lady Hamilton had pioneered techniques that would become standard practice for political and celebrity crisis management a century later. As the weeks passed, Michael expanded his research to other European royal families, finding similar patterns of scandal management across different monarchies. In the Spanish royal archives, he discovered evidence of a conspiracy to conceal the mental instability of an infant prince in the late 19th century, with an elaborate scheme involving a secret replacement of the child with a healthy cousin of similar appearance. In Denmark, he uncovered correspondence suggesting that a beloved queen had maintained a decades-long romantic relationship with her female lady-in-waiting, with the full knowledge and tacit approval of the king, who had his own arrangements with a series of official companions. Each discovery deepened Michael's understanding of how monarchies functioned behind their public facades. These weren't simply salacious stories. They were windows into the complex relationship between public image and private reality, between the mythology of royalty and the human frailties of the individuals who wore the crowns. As his sabbatical approached its midpoint, Michael faced a dilemma. The material he was uncovering was academically significant, but it also had potential for broader public interest. Several of the scandals involved royal families that still existed, with living descendants who might be affected by revelations about their ancestors. He had signed confidentiality agreements with various archives, but these typically allowed for academic publication with appropriate review. During a weekend break from his research, Michael met with Dr. Chen for tea at a small cafe near the British Museum. The autumn rain had given way to an unseasonably warm October day, and they sat at an outdoor table, watching tourists stream in and out of the museum's imposing entrance. "I've been thinking about how to approach the publication aspect of this research," Michael said, after they had exchanged pleasantries. "Some of what I've found could be sensitive, even after all these years." Dr. Chen stirred her tea thoughtfully. "The Society's position is that historical truth has value, but context and presentation matter greatly. There's a difference between scholarly analysis and sensationalism." "I agree completely," Michael nodded. "I'm not interested in exposing these scandals for shock value. What fascinates me is the institutional response, how these royal families developed sophisticated systems to manage crises and control their public narrative." "That seems like a responsible approach," Dr. Chen said. "Though I should warn you that even with that framing, you may face resistance from certain quarters. There are people who believe that some aspects of royal history should remain private, regardless of their historical significance." Michael considered this. "I understand that perspective, but I also believe that understanding how power operates, including how it conceals its own vulnerabilities, is essential to historical scholarship. These aren't just stories about individual indiscretions, they're about the machinery of monarchical self-preservation. As Michael continued his research across Europe, he began to organize his findings into what he envisioned as a scholarly book. Royal Discretion, Scandal Management in European Monarchies, 1850-1950. The manuscript would analyze the methods, networks, and institutional responses developed by various royal houses to contain potentially damaging situations. He was careful in his approach, focusing on the systems rather than sensationalizing the scandals themselves. But he also recognized that completely sanitizing the material would undermine its historical value. The specific nature of these situations was relevant to understanding why they required such elaborate containment. In Vienna, Michael's research took an unexpected turn when he gained access to the private archives of the Habsburgs, the dynasty that had ruled the Austro-Hungarian Empire until its dissolution after World War I. Among the materials was a series of reports from the Imperial Secret Police regarding surveillance of various members of the royal family. What caught Michael's attention was a file labeled simply "The Meiering Incident, Supplementary Reports." The Meiering Incident was one of the most famous royal scandals in European history, the apparent murder-suicide of Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria and his young lover, Baroness Mary Wetzera, in 1889. The official narrative had been established for over a century. The Crown Prince, depressed and politically frustrated, had formed a suicide pact with the Baroness, shooting her before turning the gun on himself. But the supplementary reports told a different story. According to confidential police investigations never made public, there was substantial evidence suggesting that Rudolf and Mary had been murdered, possibly due to Rudolf's liberal political views and his potential involvement in a plot against his father, Emperor Franz Joseph. The police reports detailed inconsistencies in the physical evidence at the hunting lodge where the bodies were found, witness statements that contradicted the official timeline, and suspicious movements of unidentified individuals in the vicinity shortly before the deaths. Most shocking was a memo from the chief of the Imperial Secret Police to the Emperor himself, discussing the necessity of the official narrative and the grave consequences for the stability of the empire if the truth were to become known. The memo explicitly recommended the suicide story as the most containable explanation and outlined strategies for ensuring all witnesses adhered to this version of events. Michael sat in the quiet archive room, stunned by the implications. If these documents were authentic, and they certainly appeared to be, they suggested that one of history's most famous royal scandals had been deliberately fabricated to cover up what was essentially a political assassination sanctioned at the highest levels of the Habsburg monarchy. This discovery shifted Michael's understanding of royal scandal management. It wasn't just about containing embarrassing personal indiscretions. In some cases, it extended to concealing acts that would now be considered serious crimes. The machinery of monarchical self-preservation was more extensive and potentially more sinister than he had initially believed. As Michael's sabbatical entered its final months, he found himself grappling with ethical questions he hadn't anticipated when he began his research. How much of what he had discovered should he include in his book? Where was the line between historical scholarship and unnecessarily exposing the private failures of individuals who, despite their royal status, were still human beings with a right to some measure of privacy? More troubling were the potential modern implications of some of his findings. The illegitimate child of Prince Alfred, for instance, had been given a new identity in a prominent Devon family. That child would have had descendants who were unknowingly related to the British royal family. Was it Michael's place to potentially disrupt the lives of these living individuals by revealing their true ancestry? The Meiering revelations presented an even more complex ethical dilemma. If the Habsburg monarchy had indeed arranged the murder of Crown Prince Rudolf and fabricated the suicide narrative, that was historically significant information that arguably should be made public. But it would also fundamentally alter the understanding of a key historical event and potentially damage the reputation of an institution, the Habsburg legacy, that still held cultural and historical importance in modern Austria. Michael decided to seek guidance from a trusted mentor, Professor Richard Harrington, who had supervised his doctoral dissertation and was now an emeritus professor at Oxford. They met at Professor Harrington's home in the Cotswolds, a picturesque stone cottage surrounded by an immaculately maintained garden. "You've uncovered quite the historical hornet's nest," Professor Harrington said after Michael had outlined his research and the ethical questions it raised. They were sitting in a book-lined study, drinking tea as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, visible through the windows. "That's putting it mildly," Michael agreed. "When I started this project, I thought I was looking at relatively minor scandals, affairs, illegitimate children, embarrassing behaviors that were hidden to maintain the dignity of the crown. I didn't expect to find evidence of what amounts to political assassination in the case of Rudolf." Professor Harrington considered this. "History is rarely as clean or simple as the official narratives would have us believe. Those in power have always shaped the story to serve their interests." He paused. "The question is, what serves the interests of historical truth now? And is historical truth an absolute value that outweighs all other considerations?" "That's exactly what I'm struggling with," Michael said. "If I include everything I've found, I could be causing real harm to living people who have done nothing wrong. But if I withhold significant findings, am I participating in the same kind of historical sanitization that I set out to expose?" "Perhaps the solution lies in how you frame your work," Professor Harrington suggested. "Your book isn't primarily about exposing specific scandals. It's about analyzing the institutional mechanisms developed to manage threats to monarchical reputation. You can discuss these mechanisms in detail without necessarily identifying every individual involved or revealing information that might harm innocent descendants. For cases like the Meyerling incident, where there are no direct living descendants whose lives would be disrupted, you might choose to be more explicit. But even then, you would present it as newly discovered evidence that suggests an alternative interpretation, not as definitive historical fact." Michael nodded slowly. "A measured approach that respects both historical truth and the potential impact on living individuals." "Precisely," Professor Harrington said. "And remember, Michael, history is an ongoing conversation. Your book won't be the final word on these matters. You're contributing to a scholarly dialogue that will continue long after your work is published." As Michael prepared to return to Boston, he made one final research trip to Paris to examine materials in the French National Archives related to scandals in the court of Napoleon III, the last monarch to rule France. What he found there provided a fitting conclusion to his project. Documents suggesting that the Empress Eugénie had maintained a network of informants specifically tasked with identifying potential scandals before they could become public, allowing for preemptive action. One memo from the Empress's chief lady-in-waiting outlined what she called the 3 pillars of discretion: prevention through vigilance, containment through swift action, and redirection through strategic counter-narratives. It was essentially a playbook for royal scandal management that could have been written by a modern public relations firm. Back in his apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with winter settling over New England, Michael began the process of organizing his extensive research into a coherent manuscript. He decided to structure the book thematically rather than chronologically or geographically, with chapters focusing on different aspects of royal scandal management, the role of trusted intermediaries, financial arrangements and settlements, strategic relocations, medical interventions, and the creation of alternative narratives. For each theme, He would draw examples from different monarchies, highlighting both the commonalities in their approaches and the distinctive elements that reflected their particular cultural and political contexts. He would be explicit about the institutional mechanisms while being judicious about the personal details, particularly in cases where revelation might affect living individuals. The chapter on the mailing incident would present the newly discovered evidence alongside the official narrative, analyzing the sophisticated multi-layered response that had successfully maintained the suicide story for over a century, despite the involvement of numerous individuals in its fabrication. As Michael worked on the manuscript, he received an unexpected email from Dr. Chen at the Royal Historical Society. "Professor Bennett, I hope this finds you well. The Society has been following your research with interest, and we've received inquiries from certain quarters about the nature and scope of your project. While we remain committed to scholarly access to our collections, I felt I should inform you that there may be some sensitivity regarding certain aspects of your findings. This is not intended to discourage your work, merely to ensure you are aware of the potential reactions it may generate." The message was politely worded, but clear in its implication. Powerful interests were aware of his research and concerned about what he might publish. It wasn't exactly pressure to self-censor, but it was certainly a reminder that his work touched on matters that some would prefer remained in the shadows. Rather than feeling intimidated, Michael found himself more committed than ever to publishing a thoughtful, ethically balanced, but fundamentally honest account of his discoveries. If institutions were still concerned about protecting these historical secrets, that only confirmed their significance. As winter turned to spring, Michael completed the first draft of his manuscript and submitted it to his editor at Cambridge University Press. The initial feedback was enthusiastic but cautious. "This is groundbreaking work that will significantly contribute to our understanding of monarchical institutions and their relationship to public perception. However, given the sensitive nature of some of the material, particularly the mailing revelations, we would recommend a thorough legal review before proceeding to publication." The legal review took several weeks, during which Michael returned to his teaching duties at Boston University. His undergraduate course on European monarchy had never been more popular. Word had spread about his research, and students were eager to hear about the real stories behind the royal facades. In one memorable class discussion, a student raised a question that cut to the heart of Michael's project. "Professor Bennett, do you think these royal scandals and how they were managed tell us anything about power in our own time? Are modern politicians and celebrities using the same playbook?" Michael considered the question carefully. What's fascinating is how many of these techniques developed by royal courts in the 19th century have become standard practice in modern reputation management. The creation of alternative narratives, strategic relocation of problematic individuals, financial settlements with confidentiality clauses, these are all still used today by the powerful to control their public image. But there's a critical difference, he continued. Monarchies operated in an environment with limited media, where information could be more effectively controlled. Today's digital landscape makes complete containment nearly impossible, yet the impulse to manage and suppress potentially damaging information remains just as strong. The legal review eventually cleared Michael's manuscript for publication, with some minor revisions to language regarding living individuals. Cambridge University Press scheduled the book for release in the fall, with plans for an academic marketing campaign that emphasized the institutional analysis aspect of the work rather than the scandals themselves. A month before publication, Michael received an unexpected invitation to present his research at a symposium on monarchical history at the University of Edinburgh. The invitation came from Professor Margaret Campbell, a leading historian of the British monarchy whose work Michael had long admired. He accepted immediately, seeing it as an opportunity to introduce his findings to a knowledgeable audience of peers before the book's general release. The symposium was held in a grand wood-panelled hall at the university, with portraits of Scottish intellectual luminaries gazing down from the walls. Michael's presentation was scheduled as the closing session of the second day, giving him time to attend other talks and get a sense of the audience. When his turn came, Michael approached the podium with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He had prepared a presentation that highlighted the sophisticated institutional responses to potential scandals across different European monarchies, using specific examples to illustrate broader patterns while being careful not to sensationalize the personal details. What emerges from this research, he concluded after 30 minutes of presentation, is a picture of monarchical institutions that were far more sophisticated in their approach to reputation management than we have previously recognized. These weren't ad hoc responses to unexpected crises, but rather systematic, institutionalized processes for identifying, containing, and neutralizing threats to the royal image. Understanding these processes gives us new insight into how monarchy, as an institution, adapted to the increasing scrutiny of the modern era and managed to survive in many European nations despite revolutionary pressures and the rise of democratic values. The Q&A session that followed was intense but respectful. Several scholars questioned his interpretation of specific incidents, particularly the Meyerling revelations, but none challenged the fundamental soundness of his research methodology or the significance of his findings. After the formal session ended, Professor Campbell approached Michael as he was gathering his notes. "That was quite illuminating, Professor Bennett," she said. "Your research adds an important dimension to our understanding of how these institutions functioned behind the public facade." "Thank you," Michael replied. "That means a great deal coming from you. Your work on the evolution of British royal ceremony was a major influence on my approach to this project." Professor Campbell smiled. "I'm hosting a small dinner this evening for some of the symposium participants. I'd be delighted if you would join us. There's someone I think you should meet, Lord Granville. He's a historian himself with a particular interest in the period you've been researching, and he has connections to some of the families mentioned in your presentation." The dinner was held in a private room at one of Edinburgh's oldest restaurants, a stone-walled space with a low ceiling and a fireplace that cast a warm glow over the assembled scholars. Lord Granville turned out to be an elderly but sharp-minded man with impeccable manners and an encyclopedic knowledge of European aristocracy. After the meal, as port was being served, Lord Granville moved to sit beside Michael. "Fascinating presentation today, Professor Bennett. Your research touches on matters that have long been the subject of private discussion in certain circles, but rarely appear in academic literature." "Thank you, Lord Granville. I've tried to approach the material with both scholarly rigor and appropriate sensitivity," Lord Granville nodded. "So I observed, which is why I wanted to speak with you privately." He lowered his voice slightly. "My grandmother was Lady Elizabeth Hamilton, daughter of Lady Sarah Hamilton, whose papers you've been studying in London." Michael tried not to show his surprise. "I had no idea. Her correspondence has been invaluable to my research." "Yes, I imagine it would be. She was quite the expert in discretion and management." Lord Granville took a sip of his port. "What you may not know is that my grandmother maintained her own private records, separate from those in the Royal Historical Society's collection. More personal observations, you might say, about the cases her mother handled." Michael's pulse quickened. "Those would be extraordinarily valuable historical documents." "Indeed they would," Lord Granville agreed. "They've remained in family hands for generations. No one outside the family has ever been permitted to see them." He paused. "Until now, perhaps." "Are you suggesting—" Michael began. "I'm suggesting that someone who has demonstrated both scholarly interest and appropriate discretion might be granted limited access to these materials under certain conditions. They contain information that would significantly expand your understanding of several cases you discussed today, particularly the Baltimore matter. Michael could hardly believe what he was hearing. I would be honored, Lord Granville, and would of course respect any conditions your family wishes to impose. Good, Lord Granville said with a slight smile. I'll be in London next month. We can make arrangements then. He rose from his chair. And Professor Bennett, one last observation. History is rarely as straightforward as even the most diligent researcher might believe. The true motivations behind actions taken long ago can be quite surprising when viewed from a different perspective. With that enigmatic comment, Lord Granville rejoined the other guests, leaving Michael to wonder what revelations the private Hamilton papers might contain and how they might alter his understanding of the scandals he had been researching. The following month, Michael found himself in Lord Granville's London townhouse, an elegant residence in Belgravia that spoke of old money and careful preservation. The private library where the Hamilton papers were kept was a wood-panelled room lined with glass-fronted bookcases containing leather-bound volumes, many appearing to be first editions of significant historical works. My grandmother's papers are in this cabinet, Lord Granville said, using a small key to unlock an antique writing desk. They've been preserved in these portfolios since her death in 1937. As I mentioned in Edinburgh, no one outside the family has ever been permitted to examine them. He removed several blue leather portfolios, each tied with silk ribbon, and placed them carefully on a reading table. I'll leave you to your research, Professor. The house staff will provide whatever refreshments you require. I ask only that you make no copies or photographs of the materials, though you may take written notes. And I would appreciate the opportunity to review any publications arising from this research before they appear in print. Left alone with the portfolios, Michael carefully untied the ribbon on the first one. Inside were bundles of letters, diary entries and memoranda, all in the distinctive handwriting of Lady Elizabeth Hamilton. Unlike her mother's official correspondence, which was formal and often circumspect, Lady Elizabeth's private observations were remarkably candid and detailed. The first portfolio focused primarily on scandals involving lesser members of the aristocracy, affairs, gambling debts, inappropriate political associations that had been managed due to their proximity to the royal family. The second contained material about the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, and his numerous indiscretions, many of which had been successfully kept from public knowledge despite involving multiple participants. It was the third portfolio that proved most revelatory. An entire section was devoted to the Baltimore incident, with detailed accounts of how the situation had been discovered, managed, and resolved. According to Lady Elizabeth's notes, the American woman, Elizabeth Wilson, had been a young music teacher from a respectable but not wealthy Baltimore family. During Prince Alfred's naval tour of the United States, he had attended a private musical soiree where Miss Wilson had performed. An attraction had developed, and the prince, accustomed to having his desires fulfilled, had pursued the relationship despite the obvious impropriety. What made the situation particularly complex was not merely the resulting pregnancy, but the fact that Miss Wilson had, upon discovering her condition, written directly to Queen Victoria. Her letter, preserved in Lady Elizabeth's papers, was respectful but firm, neither asking for marriage, which she acknowledged was impossible, nor threatening scandal, but simply informing the Queen that her son had fathered a child and expressing her belief that the Queen would want to know of her grandchild's existence. This direct approach had apparently impressed the Queen, who, according to Lady Elizabeth's notes, had remarked, "At least the girl has courage and honesty, unlike so many who would seek to profit from such a situation." The Queen had personally directed Lady Sarah Hamilton to resolve the matter with both fairness to the young woman and absolute discretion. The settlement arranged for Miss Wilson had been remarkably generous. a substantial property in San Francisco, an annual income that would allow her to live in comfort for the rest of her life, and assurances that she would be protected from any negative consequences of the affair. In return, she had agreed to absolute secrecy and to relinquish all claims on behalf of her child to royal recognition or inheritance. The child, a girl named Charlotte, had indeed been taken to England and placed with a family in Devon, as Lady Hamilton's diary had indicated. But Lady Elizabeth's papers revealed an additional dimension. The family chosen was not random, but was distantly related to the royal family through an obscure connection several generations back. This meant that Charlotte, while officially presented as an orphaned relative, would grow up in proximity to her royal relations and would be subtly watched over throughout her life. Most surprising was a note indicating that Queen Victoria had, on at least 2 occasions, arranged to observe Charlotte from a distance during public events, satisfying herself that the child was well cared for without ever acknowledging the true relationship. As Michael continued through the portfolios, he found similarly detailed accounts of other royal scandals, including several that he had not previously uncovered in his research. Lady Elizabeth had been her mother's confidant and had eventually taken over many of her responsibilities in managing sensitive situations for the royal household. The Meyerling incident was also addressed, though not in the same detail as the Habsburg police reports Michael had discovered in Vienna. Lady Elizabeth noted that information had reached Queen Victoria through diplomatic channels, suggesting that the official suicide narrative was a convenient fiction, but offered no specific evidence contradicting that narrative. She did, however, comment on the remarkable efficiency with which Emperor Franz Joseph contained what could have been a dynasty-ending revelation. By the time Michael had finished reviewing all 5 portfolios, his understanding of royal scandal management had been significantly deepened. What emerged most clearly was that these weren't simply reactive measures to unexpected crises, but rather a sophisticated institutionalized system for protecting the monarchy as an institution, even at the expense of individual members when necessary. When Lord Granville returned to the library in the late afternoon, Michael expressed his profound gratitude for the access to these invaluable materials. They provide context and detail that transforms my understanding of how these situations were managed, he said. Particularly the Baltimore incident. The personal involvement of Queen Victoria changes the entire complexion of that case. Lord Granville nodded. My grandmother believed that the Queen's response to that situation revealed much about her character that was never visible to the public. Behind the stern, moralistic facade she presented to society was a woman capable of remarkable pragmatism and even compassion when circumstances required it. Do you have any objection to my including these insights in my book? Michael asked, with appropriate anonymity for the sources, of course. I believe history is best served by truth, carefully presented, Lord Granville replied. You've demonstrated sensitivity in your approach to these matters. I would ask only that you allow me to review the specific passages before publication. As Michael prepared to leave, Lord Granville handed him a small envelope. One last document that might interest you, Professor. My grandmother kept it separate from the main collection due to its particularly sensitive nature. Later, in his hotel room, Michael opened the envelope to find a single sheet of paper containing what appeared to be a family tree. At the top was Prince Alfred's name, and below it, connected by a line, was Elizabeth Wilson. Below them both was Charlotte, and then a descending line of names continuing to the present day. The final name on the tree was Margaret Elizabeth Campbell, Professor Margaret Campbell, who had hosted the symposium in Edinburgh and introduced Michael to Lord Granville. Michael stared at the document in astonishment. Professor Campbell, one of Britain's most respected royal historians, was herself a direct descendant of Prince Alfred's illegitimate daughter. The revelation cast her scholarly career in an entirely new light had she known of her royal ancestry, Had it influenced her choice to specialize in the history of the British monarchy? The next morning, Michael received an email from Professor Campbell inviting him to tea at her London flat that afternoon. The timing suggested that Lord Granville had informed her of Michael's discovery of her connection to the royal family. Professor Campbell's flat was in a converted Victorian building in Bloomsbury, its walls lined with bookshelves and adorned with historical prints of royal ceremonies and portraits. She greeted Michael warmly, showing no sign of discomfort or anxiety about the purpose of their meeting. After they were settled with tea and biscuits, she addressed the matter directly. "I imagine you have questions, Professor Bennet, after what Lord Granville showed you yesterday." "I do," Michael admitted, "though I want to assure you that I have no intention of including any information that would identify you personally in my book." Professor Campbell smiled. "I appreciate that, though I'm not particularly concerned. My connection to Prince Alfred is so distant and so thoroughly obscured by time and deliberate concealment that it would hardly cause a sensation if revealed." "You know about your ancestry then?" Michael asked. "My grandmother told me when I was in my 20s, already committed to my career as a historian. It was presented as a family story, almost a legend, with no documentation to support it. I half believed it, half thought it was a romanticized family myth." She took a sip of her tea. "It wasn't until I became established in academic circles and was granted access to certain restricted royal archives that I found hints suggesting the story might be true. Lord Granville approached me about 5 years ago, having noticed my research interests and suspected a connection to his family's history." "Did knowing this influence your choice to specialize in royal history?" Michael asked. "Not consciously," Professor Campbell replied. "I was drawn to the study of monarchy as an institution long before I knew of any personal connection. But perhaps there was some unconscious attraction to the subject." She paused. "What interests me about your research, Professor Bennet, is that you've approached these scandals not as salacious gossip, but as windows into how the institution of monarchy adapted and protected itself. That's consistent with my own view of royal history. The mechanisms of scandal management reveal so much about how power operates." Michael agreed. "It's not just about covering up embarrassing incidents. It's about controlling the narrative around monarchy itself, preserving its mystique and authority even as the individuals who embody it fail in various human ways." They spent the next hour discussing Michael's findings and their implications for understanding monarchy as a political and cultural institution. Professor Campbell offered valuable insights from her own research, particularly regarding how the management of royal image evolved in response to the changing media landscape of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As their meeting concluded, Professor Campbell made an unexpected offer. "I'm editing a special issue of the Journal of Royal Studies next year, focusing on the private mechanisms that supported public monarchical power. I'd be interested in a contribution from you based on your research, perhaps focusing on the role of trusted female intermediaries like Lady Hamilton in managing sensitive matters." "I'd be honored," Michael replied. "Though I'm curious, aren't you concerned that my work might somehow reflect on you personally, given your connection to one of the scandals I've researched?" Professor Campbell smiled. "Professor Bennet, I'm a historian first and foremost. My commitment is to understanding the past as accurately as possible, regardless of any personal connections. Besides, what happened between Prince Alfred and Elizabeth Wilson was hardly a scandal by modern standards. Merely a love affair that crossed boundaries of class and nationality, resulting in a child. The scandal was in how society at that time would have perceived it, not in the relationship itself." In the months that followed, Michael completed his book manuscript, incorporating the insights gained from Lord Granville's family papers while respecting the confidentiality agreements he had made. Royal Discretion, Scandal Management in European Monarchies, 1850 to 1950, was published to considerable academic acclaim and unexpected popular interest. The book's balanced approach, analyzing the institutional mechanisms of scandal management without sensationalizing the personal details, earned praise from reviewers in both scholarly journals and mainstream publications. Several royal historians publicly acknowledged that Michael's work had opened new perspectives on how monarchies had adapted to the challenges of increasing public scrutiny in the modern era. There were, predictably, some critics who felt he had been either too revealing of sensitive matters or not revealing enough, depending on their perspective. A few tabloids attempted to extrapolate from his scholarly analysis to make more sensational claims about current royal families, prompting Michael to give several interviews clarifying the historical focus of his research and refusing to speculate on contemporary applications. A year after the book's publication, Michael was invited to deliver a lecture at the Royal Historical Society in London, a significant recognition of his contribution to the field. Dr. Chen, who had been instrumental in granting him access to Lady Hamilton's correspondence at the beginning of his research, introduced him to the distinguished audience of historians, archivists, and a few discreet representatives of Europe's remaining royal families. Professor Bennett's work has demonstrated how historical scholarship can illuminate the institutional workings of monarchy while maintaining appropriate respect for the individuals involved, she said in her introduction. His research reminds us that behind the public facade of royal power were complex human beings, navigating the constraints of their positions, supported by sophisticated systems designed to protect both the individuals and the institution they embodied. As Michael took the podium and looked out at the audience, he reflected on the journey that had begun with his curiosity about Lady Elizabeth Cromwell's oblique references to the Windsor affair in her diary. What had started as an investigation into forgotten scandals had evolved into a deeper understanding of how monarchy as an institution had survived into the modern era despite the human frailties of those who wore the crowns. The story of royal scandal management is not ultimately about the scandals themselves, he began, but about the tension between the public myth of monarchy and the private reality of human weakness. It is about the elaborate machinery developed to maintain that myth in the face of realities that might undermine it. And in understanding that machinery, we gain insight not just into how monarchy functioned historically, but into the broader relationship between power, public perception, and private truth that continues to shape our political and cultural institutions today. As he continued his lecture, Michael knew that he had only scratched the surface of the hidden history of royal scandals. For every story he had uncovered, there were likely dozens more that remained buried in private archives or lost to history entirely. But he had opened a window into a previously obscured aspect of monarchical power, revealing the sophisticated systems that had managed royal reputation long before the term public relations had been coined. In doing so, he had contributed not just to the historical record, but to a deeper understanding of how institutions protect themselves and shape their public narratives, a process that continues in different forms across all centers of power in the modern world. The strangest royal scandals, it turned out, were not just colorful historical footnotes, but windows into the very nature of power itself. The lecture at the Royal Historical Society marked a turning point in Michael's career. What had begun as a specialized research project had established him as a leading authority on the hidden mechanisms of monarchical power. Invitations to speak at universities and historical societies across Europe and North America filled his inbox, and his department chair at Boston University, Professor Hayes, was delighted by the positive attention his work had brought to the history department. "The dean is practically giddy," she told Michael during a department meeting. Turns out, researching royal scandals wasn't so sensationalistic after all, now that the Journal of Modern History has called your book a groundbreaking contribution to institutional analysis of monarchical power. Michael smiled at the vindication, but found himself already looking beyond the success of his first book. The research had opened doors to archives and collections previously inaccessible to him, and each new document seemed to reveal connections to other hidden histories. He had begun to compile notes for a second volume, this one focusing specifically on the role of medical professionals in managing royal secrets, from concealing illnesses that might be perceived as weaknesses to providing convenient explanations for necessary absences or behavioral irregularities. On a crisp autumn morning, as Michael was preparing for his undergraduate lecture on European political systems, he received an email that would set him on yet another unexpected path. The message came from a Dr. Henrik Lindholm of the Swedish Royal Archives. Professor Bennett, your recent work on royal scandal management has generated considerable interest among Scandinavian historians. In reviewing our restricted collections in light of your research framework, we have identified materials related to the Swedish and Danish royal families that may be relevant to your ongoing work. These include the private correspondence of Queen Louisa of Sweden and Norway regarding what our archival catalogue refers to only as the Copenhagen Incident of 1885. If you would be interested in examining these materials, we would be pleased to grant you access under our standard confidentiality protocols. Michael's interest was immediately piqued. The Scandinavian monarchies had not featured prominently in his first book, primarily due to limited access to their archives. This invitation represented an opportunity to expand his research into new territories and potentially uncover patterns of scandal management that transcended national and cultural boundaries. Within weeks, Michael had arranged another research trip to Europe, this time beginning in Stockholm. The Swedish Royal Archives were housed in a stately 18th century building near the Royal Palace, its granite facade conveying appropriate gravitas for an institution dedicated to preserving royal history. Dr. Lindholm proved to be a thin, precise man, with wire-rimmed glasses and an encyclopedic knowledge of Swedish royal history. Queen Louisa was a fascinating figure, he explained, as he led Michael through security to the restricted collections area. Danish by birth, married to King Carl XV of Sweden, she was known publicly for her charitable works and quiet dignity, but her private correspondence reveals a shrewd political mind and remarkable skill in managing delicate situations. The materials related to the Copenhagen incident were contained in a single archival box, much smaller than the extensive Hamilton papers Michael had examined in London. Inside were letters between Queen Louisa and her brother, Prince Frederick of Denmark, along with correspondence with various officials and physicians. The incident, Michael discovered, centered around Prince Frederick's eldest son, Prince Christian. According to the correspondence, the young prince had, during a visit to Copenhagen in 1885, become involved with a married woman from a prominent Danish family. The affair itself was scandalous enough, but the situation had been complicated by the woman's subsequent suicide attempt when the prince ended the relationship. What made the case particularly sensitive was that Prince Christian was already betrothed to a German princess in a match that had significant diplomatic implications for Denmark's precarious position between the expanding German Empire and its Scandinavian neighbors. Queen Louisa's letters revealed a carefully orchestrated response to the crisis. The woman's suicide attempt was officially attributed to nervous exhaustion, and she was quietly removed to a private sanitarium in Switzerland. Her husband was granted a diplomatic posting to St. Petersburg, effectively removing the entire family from Danish society while maintaining their social standing. Prince Christian was sent on an extended tour of European capitals, ostensibly to further his education, but actually to distance him from the scandal until it had been contained. Most intriguing to Michael was the systematic way in which Queen Louisa had managed the flow of information. She had personally met with the editors of Copenhagen's major newspapers, appealing to their patriotism and concern for the monarchy's stability to ensure their discretion. She had arranged for a series of prominent social events specifically designed to generate alternative topics of conversation in society circles. And she had deployed trusted physicians to provide medical explanations that diverted attention from the true nature of the crisis. It's remarkably similar to the techniques Lady Hamilton employed in the British court, Michael commented to Dr. Lindholm as they discussed his findings over lunch in the archive's small cafe. The same basic elements, medical cover stories, strategic relocations, creation of alternative narratives, but adapted to the specific cultural and political context of Scandinavia. That's what makes your research approach so valuable, Dr. Lindholm replied. You're identifying patterns across different monarchies that suggest these weren't just ad hoc responses, but systematic institutional practices. What's particularly interesting about the Copenhagen incident, Michael continued, is Queen Louisa's direct involvement. As both a Swedish queen and a Danish princess, she was uniquely positioned to manage a situation that crossed national boundaries. Her family connections gave her leverage with key figures in both countries. Dr. Lindholm nodded. Royal families were, in many ways, a transnational institution with shared interests that sometimes superseded national considerations. Queen Louisa understood this intuitively. After completing his research in Stockholm, Michael traveled to Copenhagen to follow up on aspects of the incident from the Danish perspective. The Danish Royal Archives contained less direct material about the scandal, evidence of successful containment, but did include personal papers of the court physician who had treated the woman involved in the affair. The physician's notes, written in a nearly indecipherable hand that required hours of careful deciphering, revealed another dimension to the story. The woman's condition following her suicide attempt had been complicated by the fact that she was pregnant, presumably with Prince Christian's child. The physician had been tasked with both treating her immediate injuries and managing this additional sensitive matter. His clinical notes documented a procedure to address the unfortunate condition. Performed at the private sanitarium in Switzerland, a discreet termination of the pregnancy that would have been scandalous and likely illegal in Denmark at that time. The physician's involvement highlighted another aspect of royal scandal management that Michael had observed in other cases: the willingness to operate outside normal legal and moral boundaries when necessary to protect the institution. From Denmark, Michael's research took him to Norway, which had been in a personal union with Sweden at the time of the Copenhagen incident. The Norwegian National Archives contained correspondence from the Swedish-Norwegian Foreign Ministry, discussing the potential diplomatic implications if the scandal had become public, particularly regarding relations with Germany. A confidential memo from the foreign minister to King Oscar II, who had succeeded Queen Louisa's husband, outlined contingency plans for managing German reactions, including prepared statements emphasizing Prince Christian's genuine affection for his German fiancée and attributing any rumors to political elements seeking to undermine Scandinavian-German relations. What struck Michael about this document was its forward-looking approach to scandal management, anticipating potential developments and preparing responses in advance rather than simply reacting to events as they unfolded. This suggested a level of institutional sophistication that went beyond individual crisis management to something approaching modern strategic communications planning. As Michael continued his research across Scandinavia, he uncovered additional cases that fit the pattern he had identified. A Norwegian prince, whose gambling debts had been secretly paid by the Swedish crown to prevent embarrassment to the United Monarchy. A Danish princess whose romantic correspondence with a Russian Grand Duke had been intercepted and suppressed due to its politically sensitive nature. A Swedish duke whose progressive political views had been contained within private, intellectual circles rather than allowing them public expression that might compromise the crown's political neutrality. Each case added nuance to Michael's understanding of how royal scandal management operated across different cultural contexts while maintaining certain core principles and techniques. The Scandinavian approach seemed to place particular emphasis on medical explanations and appeals to patriotic discretion, reflecting cultural values that prioritized both scientific rationality and national solidarity. When Michael returned to Boston after 2 months of European research, he found himself with material that could significantly expand the scope of his next book. The Scandinavian cases provided a valuable comparative dimension to his analysis of British and Central European approaches to royal scandal management. His department had arranged a welcome-back reception, where Professor Hayes introduced him to a new faculty member, Dr. Julia Morales, a specialist in Spanish colonial history whose work examined how European monarchical systems had been adapted in the American colonies. Julia's research on how the Spanish crown managed scandals involving colonial officials might complement your work, Professor Hayes suggested. Different context, same institutional challenges. Dr. Morales proved to be a vibrant woman in her late 30s with an infectious enthusiasm for historical detective work. "I read your book over the summer," she told Michael as they chatted by the refreshment table. "It immediately made me think about parallels in how the Spanish monarchy handled potentially embarrassing situations in their American territories. Distance created both challenges and opportunities for scandal management." Their conversation continued long after the reception ended, moving to a small cafe near campus where they discovered shared interests, not just in institutional history, but in classical music and hiking the New England trails. Michael found himself drawn to Julia's intellectual energy and the fresh perspective she brought to his research questions. The fundamental challenge for monarchy has always been reconciling the human fallibility of individual royals with the need for the institution to appear beyond ordinary human weakness, Julia observed as they discussed Michael's Scandinavian findings. "What's fascinating about your work is how it reveals the elaborate machinery developed to manage that contradiction." "Exactly," Michael agreed. "And what's striking is how similar that machinery was across different European monarchies, despite cultural variations. It suggests a kind of institutional learning, where effective techniques were observed and adapted across royal courts." "Have you considered looking at how these techniques were exported to colonial contexts?" Julia asked. The Spanish viceroys in Mexico and Peru were essentially mini-monarchs, representing the crown, but operating with considerable autonomy due to distance. They developed their own scandal management systems that mirrored European practices, but adapted them to colonial realities. This conversation planted the seed for a collaborative project that would eventually expand Michael's research in unexpected directions. But first, he needed to complete his work on the Scandinavian materials and integrate them into his evolving understanding of royal scandal management as a transnational phenomenon. Over the next few months, Michael divided his time between teaching, writing, and developing his relationship with Julia, which had quickly evolved from professional collaboration to personal connection. They began co-writing an article on comparative approaches to scandal management across European monarchies and colonial administrations, finding that their research interests complemented each other in productive ways. In early spring, Michael received another unexpected communication, this time from the Netherlands. Dr. Willem van der Meer, Director of Research at the Dutch Royal Archives, had read Michael's book and had information about a scandal involving the Dutch and British royal families that had been successfully contained for over a century. The incident concerns Queen Emma of the Netherlands and her relationship with certain members of the British royal family during her regency period, Dr. van der Meer wrote. Our archives contain correspondence suggesting that financial arrangements of a sensitive nature were made to prevent details of this relationship from becoming public. Given your expertise in this area, we would be interested in your assessment of these materials from a comparative institutional perspective. This invitation led to yet another European research trip, this time with Julia accompanying him to pursue her own research on Spanish colonial administrators. They began in The Hague, where the Dutch Royal Archives provided access to Queen Emma's private correspondence and financial records. Queen Emma, Michael discovered, had served as regent of the Netherlands from 1890 to 1898, while her daughter, the future Queen Wilhelmina, was still a minor. During this period, she had maintained close ties with the British royal family, particularly with certain cousins of Queen Victoria, who held no official roles but maintained proximity to the court. The correspondence revealed that one of these royal cousins, Lord Alfred Mountbatten, had approached Queen Emma with a scheme to leverage their royal connections for financial gain, proposing a partnership in speculative investments in South African mining ventures. Such commercial activities would have been considered deeply inappropriate for members of royal families, whose financial affairs were expected to remain above the taint of speculation or exploitation of royal status for profit. Queen Emma had initially rejected the proposal, but had subsequently discovered that Lord Alfred had already used her name in approaching potential investors, creating a potentially embarrassing situation. Rather than exposing Lord Alfred's impropriety, which would have created a scandal touching both the Dutch and British royal families, Queen Emma had worked with trusted financial advisors to quietly unwind the investments and compensate those who had been misled. The financial records documented a series of transactions through Swiss banks that effectively bought the silence of all involved parties while extracting Queen Emma from any association with the scheme. Alongside these transactions were communications with Queen Victoria's private secretary, suggesting that the British monarch had been informed of the situation and had tacitly approved the approach to containing it. It's a perfect example of transnational cooperation in royal scandal management, Michael commented to Julia as they discussed his findings over dinner at their hotel in The Hague. The Dutch and British monarchies recognized their shared interest in preventing a scandal that would have damaged the reputation of royalty as an institution beyond the specific individuals involved. And the financial dimension is fascinating, Julia added. It shows how royal families were navigating the increasingly complex relationship between traditional monarchy and modern capitalism. They needed to appear above commercial interests while simultaneously protecting their substantial wealth. From the Netherlands, Michael and Julia traveled to Spain, where Julia had arranged access to colonial administrative records in the Archive of the Indies in Seville. These documents revealed how Spanish viceroys in the Americas had adapted European techniques of scandal management to the colonial context, developing systems for containing potentially damaging information about corruption, moral indiscretions, or abuses of power. The distance from Madrid created both challenges and opportunities, Julia explained, as they examined correspondence between an 18th century viceroy of New Spain and his representatives in the Spanish court. On one hand, it was harder to control information across such distances. On the other, the very distance meant that scandals could be more effectively localized and contained before they reached European awareness. The colonial records documented cases of viceroys concealing their own misconduct, financial improprieties, affairs with local women, conflicts of interest in granting contracts and privileges, as well as managing scandals involving other colonial officials and even members of the viceregal family. The techniques employed echoed those Michael had identified in European royal courts: strategic relocations of problematic individuals, financial settlements to secure silence, medical explanations for sudden absences, and the creation of alternative narratives to explain unexpected events. What's remarkable is how consistent the basic playbook was, Michael observed. Whether in London, Stockholm or Mexico City, the institutional response to potential scandal followed similar patterns, adapted to local cultural and political contexts. Their research in Spain led to an invitation to present at a symposium on colonial governance at the University of Seville, where Michael and Julia's comparative approach to scandal management across European and colonial contexts generated considerable interest among historians of empire. Their presentation, titled Institutional Responses to Threats to Authority, Royal Scandal Management in Transnational Perspective, positioned their research within broader conversations about how systems of power maintain legitimacy in the face of human failings. As the symposium concluded, Michael received an email from Lord Granville in London containing a tantalizing new lead. Professor Bennett, in reviewing some family papers recently transferred from our country estate, I've discovered correspondence suggesting a connection between the Baltimore incident you investigated and a similar situation involving the Russian imperial family some years later. It appears that Lady Hamilton's expertise in managing such matters led to her being consulted by confidants of Tsarina Maria Feodorovna regarding a delicate situation in St. Petersburg. I believe this might interest you as evidence of the transnational nature of royal scandal management techniques that you've been documenting. This unexpected connection between British and Russian royal scandal management added yet another dimension to Michael's expanding research. The Russian imperial family had been notably absent from his initial book, largely due to the destruction of records following the Russian Revolution and the difficulty of accessing what remained in Soviet and post-Soviet archives. Lord Granville's discovery provided a potential entry point into this aspect of royal scandal management through British sources, offering a glimpse into how techniques developed in Western European monarchies might have been adapted to the very different cultural and political context of Tsarist Russia. Michael and Julia decided to extend their European research trip to include London, where Lord Granville provided access to the newly discovered correspondence. The letters, exchanged between Lady Sarah Hamilton and Countess Olga Vorontsova, a lady-in-waiting to Tsarina Maria Feodorovna, revealed that the Russian imperial family had faced a situation remarkably similar to the Baltimore incident. A member of the Romanov family had fathered a child with a woman of inappropriate social standing during travels abroad. In this case, the individual involved was Grand Duke Alexei Alexandrovich, the fourth son of Tsar Alexander II, who had conducted an affair with an American woman during his official visit to the United States in 1871-1872. The affair had resulted in a child, and the woman had eventually made claims that threatened to become public, potentially embarrassing both the Russian imperial family and their American diplomatic hosts. Countess Vorontsova, aware of how the British royal family had handled similar situations, had reached out to Lady Hamilton for advice. The resulting correspondence detailed a systematic approach to containing the scandal that drew directly on British techniques but adapted them to Russian realities. The transnational sharing of expertise is explicit here, Michael noted, as he and Julia reviewed the letters. Lady Hamilton isn't just offering general advice, she's providing specific techniques and approaches that had proven effective in the British context, along with suggestions for how they might be modified to suit Russian circumstances. The Russian case had ultimately been resolved through a combination of financial settlement, relocation of the American woman to Paris, where she would be under more direct observation than in the United States, and the creation of a new identity for the child, who was integrated into the household of a Russian diplomat serving abroad as a ward of the family. What particularly interested Michael was evidence that this exchange of expertise in scandal management had not been an isolated incident, but part of a more general pattern of institutional learning among European monarchies. The correspondence mentioned other consultations between royal households regarding sensitive matters, suggesting an informal network for sharing effective techniques for protecting the institution of monarchy from potential damage due to individual indiscretions. As Michael and Julia's research continued to uncover connections between seemingly disparate royal scandals across different monarchies, a more comprehensive picture began to emerge. Royal scandal management had functioned as a transnational system of institutional self-preservation, adapting common techniques to diverse cultural and political contexts while maintaining core strategies that had proven effective across boundaries. This perspective formed the theoretical framework for Michael's second book, which he began drafting upon their return to Boston. Titled Beyond Borders, The Transnational Management of Royal Scandal, 1850-1950, the book would expand on his earlier work by examining how techniques for containing potentially damaging information were shared and adapted across different monarchical systems, from Western Europe to Russia and from metropolitan centers to colonial outposts. Julia's contribution was essential to this expanded framework, bringing her expertise on colonial governance systems and Spanish imperial administration to complement Michael's focus on European royal families. Their professional collaboration had deepened their personal relationship, and by the time the book manuscript was taking shape, they had moved in together, sharing a larger apartment in Cambridge that accommodated their combined collections of books and research materials. As word of their ongoing research spread through academic circles, Michael and Julia received an unexpected invitation from Professor Hiroaki Tanaka of Tokyo University, a historian of the Japanese imperial system. Your work on European royal scandal management has significant parallels to practices I have documented in the Japanese imperial household, Professor Tanaka wrote. While operating in a very different cultural context, the Imperial Household Agency developed sophisticated techniques for managing potentially damaging information about members of the imperial family, particularly during the Meiji and Taisho periods, when Japan was consciously adapting Western monarchical practices while maintaining the unique character of the imperial institution. And this invitation led to yet another research trip, this time to Japan, where Professor Tanaka had arranged access to selected materials from the Imperial Household Agency archives that had never before been available to Western scholars. These documents revealed how Japanese imperial advisors had studied European monarchical practices during Japan's modernization period and had adapted certain approaches to scandal management while rejecting others that were incompatible with Japanese cultural values and imperial traditions. What's fascinating about the Japanese case, Professor Tanaka explained as he guided Michael and Julia through the materials, is the selective adaptation of Western techniques. The Imperial Household Agency adopted the European practice of strategic relocation, moving problematic individuals to remote positions or creating plausible reasons for their absence from court. But they rejected the financial settlement approach common in Europe, considering it undignified and potentially corrupting. Instead, the Japanese imperial system had developed its own distinctive approaches to containing potential scandals, drawing on traditional concepts of honor and obligation. Rather than buying silence, the imperial household created relationships of reciprocal obligation, where those who maintained discretion about sensitive matters were rewarded with positions, honors, and inclusion in elite circles, while those who breached such discretion faced not just official censure, but social ostracism. The Japanese materials documented several cases where members of the imperial family had engaged in behavior that conflicted with their public image as embodiments of Japanese virtue and tradition. Political disagreements with government policy that had to be suppressed to maintain the fiction of imperial unity with the state. Personal relationships that contradicted the carefully cultivated image of the imperial family. Health issues that might have been perceived as weakening the imperial line, In each case, the Imperial Household Agency had contained the potential damage through a combination of traditional Japanese approaches to discretion and adapted Western techniques of narrative management and strategic deployment of medical expertise. The resulting system was neither wholly Japanese nor European, but a hybrid approach that served the specific needs of the Japanese imperial institution during a period of rapid modernization and changing international relationships. This adds an entirely new dimension to our understanding of royal scandal management as a transnational phenomenon, Michael commented to Julia as they discussed their findings. It's not simply about European techniques being exported unchanged to other contexts, but about how different monarchical systems adapted and transformed these approaches based on their own cultural values and institutional needs. Today, the Japanese research prompted Michael to reconsider his theoretical framework, moving beyond a Eurocentric model to a more globally comparative approach that recognized both the commonalities in how monarchies managed potential scandals and the distinctive cultural variations that shaped specific practices. As their research in Japan concluded, Michael and Julia decided to extend their trip to include South Korea, where they had been invited to examine materials related to the Korean imperial family during the late Joseon dynasty and the brief Korean Empire period before Japanese colonization. These materials provided yet another comparative case, showing how a non-Western monarchy had developed its own approaches to managing potentially damaging information about royal family members while navigating intense pressures from competing foreign influences. Upon their return to Boston, Michael and Julia found themselves with research materials spanning 4 continents and multiple monarchical systems, from established European dynasties to the transformed Japanese imperial institution and the embattled Korean royal house. The scope of their project had expanded far beyond Michael's original focus on forgotten European royal scandals to encompass a global analysis of how monarchies as institutions manage threats to their legitimacy and public image. This expanded perspective led to a collaboration with Dr. Aisha Rahman, a historian of Middle Eastern monarchies at New York University, who had been conducting similar research on scandal management in the Ottoman court and the Egyptian royal family. Together, the 3 scholars organized a conference titled Monarchy and Institutional Resilience, Managing Threats to Legitimacy Across Cultures, bringing together historians specializing in royal and imperial systems from around the world. The conference, held at Boston University with funding from several prestigious historical societies, featured panels on European, Asian, Middle Eastern, and colonial monarchical systems, examining how different royal institutions had developed mechanisms for containing potentially damaging information and preserving their public image across changing historical circumstances. In his keynote address, Michael reflected on how far his research had evolved from its initial focus. What began as an investigation into forgotten scandals in European royal families has revealed a much broader pattern of institutional self-preservation that transcends cultural and national boundaries. Across vastly different contexts, monarchies developed sophisticated systems for managing threats to their legitimacy and public image, adapting common techniques to their specific cultural and political environments while maintaining certain core strategies that proved effective across boundaries. These systems tell us something profound about monarchy as a political institution, about its remarkable adaptability in the face of changing social norms and political realities, about the tension between the human fallibility of individual royals and the need for the institution to appear beyond ordinary human weakness, and about the complex relationship between public myth and private reality that sustains all systems of traditional authority. Indeed, the conference generated significant academic interest and led to the publication of an edited volume featuring contributions from all participants, positioning the study of royal scandal management as a legitimate and valuable approach to understanding monarchical institutions across different historical and cultural contexts. For Michael, the journey that had begun with Lady Elizabeth Cromwell's cryptic references to the Windsor affair had opened up an entirely new perspective on how power operates and preserves itself, revealing the sophisticated institutional mechanisms that support public images of authority while managing the private realities that might undermine them. As he and Julia continued their research and writing, expanding the scope of their analysis to include contemporary applications of these historical techniques in modern political and celebrity contexts, Michael reflected on the universal insight at the heart of their work. Behind every public facade of power and perfection lies a machinery of management, containing the human realities that might otherwise shatter the necessary illusions of authority. The strangest royal scandals, carefully buried in restricted archives and private correspondence, had ultimately revealed not just colorful historical anecdotes, but fundamental truths about the nature of power itself, how it presents itself to the world, how it conceals its vulnerabilities, and how it adapts to survive in changing times. In uncovering these forgotten stories, Michael had illuminated not just the past, but the present, showing how the techniques pioneered by figures like Lady Sarah Hamilton continue to shape our understanding of power and public image in the modern world. The academic success of the conference and the edited volume elevated Michael and Julia's research to new prominence. Their work began to attract attention beyond scholarly circles, with journalists and political commentators drawing connections between historical royal scandal management and contemporary public relations strategies. In early summer, Michael received an unexpected call from a producer at the PBS documentary series Power and Politics. "Professor Bennett, we're developing a 3-part documentary on how political image management has evolved from monarchical courts to modern democracies. Your research provides the perfect historical foundation for this analysis. Would you and Dr. Morales be interested in serving as academic consultants for the project?" After discussing it with Julia, Michael agreed to the collaboration. Over the next several months, they worked closely with the documentary team, reviewing scripts, providing historical context, and occasionally appearing on camera to explain specific examples from their research. The process gave them a new perspective on their work, forcing them to articulate complex historical patterns in accessible language for a general audience. What fascinates people about these royal scandals isn't just the salacious details, Julia observed as they reviewed footage from their interviews. It's the recognition that the same patterns of information control and narrative management are still operating in contemporary politics and celebrity culture. Exactly, Michael agreed. When we describe how Lady Hamilton created alternative narratives to explain a royal's sudden departure from London, viewers immediately make connections to how modern political figures handle potentially damaging situations. The techniques have been refined and adapted to new media environments, but the core strategies remain remarkably consistent. The documentary, titled "The Machinery of Image: From Royal Courts to the Digital Age," aired on PBS to critical acclaim and surprising popularity. Michael and Julia found themselves receiving invitations to speak at non-academic venues, think tanks, corporate conferences on crisis management, even a prestigious law school symposium on privacy and public figures. This wider exposure brought their research to the attention of Sebastian Clark, a former political consultant who had managed communications for several presidential campaigns before founding a strategic communications firm that specialized in crisis management for high-profile clients. Clark reached out to Michael with an intriguing proposal. "Professor Bennett, your historical analysis of royal scandal management has remarkable parallels to the work we do today," Clark explained over lunch at an upscale Boston restaurant. I'd like to offer you and Dr. Morales a consulting arrangement. My firm would benefit from your historical perspective, and you would gain insight into how these techniques have evolved in the digital age. Michael was initially hesitant. Mr. Clark, we're historians, not PR consultants. I'm not sure how our academic expertise would translate to your practical needs. Clark smiled. That's precisely why I'm interested. You see patterns across centuries and cultures that most of us in the industry miss because we're focused on immediate crises. Your historical perspective could help us develop more sophisticated, nuanced approaches to managing sensitive situations for our clients. After discussing the proposal with Julia, Michael agreed to a limited consulting arrangement. They would provide historical context and analysis for Clark's firm, but would not be involved in developing specific strategies for clients. This boundary would maintain their academic integrity while allowing them to observe modern applications of the historical techniques they had been studying. Their collaboration with Clark's firm provided fascinating insights into how the methods pioneered by figures like Lady Hamilton had evolved in response to changing media environments and social norms. The basic principles remained remarkably consistent: controlling information flow, creating alternative narratives, strategic relocation of problematic individuals, medical explanations for unexpected behavior, but the specific implementation had been transformed by digital technology and the 24-hour news cycle. In some ways, it's more difficult now, Clark explained during one of their consultation sessions. The speed of information flow means there's less time to develop and implement containment strategies. But in other ways, it's easier. The constant churn of news means that today's scandal is quickly replaced by tomorrow's, and public attention is increasingly fragmented. What particularly interested Michael and Julia was how different types of institutions adapted these techniques to their specific needs and cultural contexts. Political operations emphasized message discipline and rapid response. Corporate entities focused on legal containment and strategic silence. Entertainment industries developed sophisticated systems for managing the public images of celebrities while containing potentially damaging information about their private behavior. It's a modern version of the transnational adaptation we observed in historical royal systems, Julia noted. Different institutional contexts require different implementations of the same basic strategies. Their consulting work with Clark's firm coincided with the final stages of writing their book, Beyond Borders: The Transnational Management of Royal Scandal. The contemporary insights they gained through the consulting arrangement influenced their concluding chapter, which examined the legacy of royal scandal management techniques in modern institutional practices. As the book neared completion, Michael received an email from Dr. Chen at the Royal Historical Society. Professor Bennett, the Society has been informed that certain historical documents related to your research are scheduled for public release under the British government's 100-year rule for sensitive materials. These include Foreign Office records related to collaborative efforts between European royal households to manage potentially damaging information between 1880 and 1920. Given your expertise in this area, the Society would like to invite you to participate in a scholarly assessment of these materials before their public release. This would involve working with a small team of historians to provide context and analysis for what might be significant new historical evidence. The timing was perfect. Michael and Julia had just submitted their manuscript to Cambridge University Press and were available for a new research project. They arranged to spend the summer in London, working with the team assembled by the Royal Historical Society to review the soon-to-be-released materials. The documents proved to be even more significant than anticipated. They revealed the existence of a formal, if discreet, agreement among several European royal households, British, German, Russian and Austro-Hungarian, to cooperate in managing potential scandals that crossed national boundaries. This gentleman's agreement of 1897, as it was called in the correspondence, established protocols for sharing information, coordinating responses, and providing mutual assistance when royal indiscretions threatened to become public. This confirms what we suspected, but couldn't definitively prove, Michael told Julia as they reviewed the documents. Royal scandal management wasn't just similar across different monarchies due to parallel evolution. There was actual coordination and deliberate sharing of techniques. The Foreign Office records documented several cases where this agreement had been activated. A German prince's gambling debts in London that were quietly settled by British officials to avoid embarrassment to the Kaiser's family. A Russian Grand Duke's indiscreet political comments at a British country house party that were kept out of the press through coordinated efforts. A Habsburg Archduke's affair with an English noblewoman that was contained through a mutually agreed upon narrative of illness and recuperation. Most significantly, the records included references to a secured communication channel specifically established for royal household officials responsible for discretionary matters. This channel had operated outside normal diplomatic protocols, allowing for direct, unofficial communication about sensitive situations that required coordinated management. It was essentially an early version of a crisis management network, Julia observed. These royal officials recognized that scandals involving multiple royal families required coordinated responses, and they developed a system specifically for that purpose. The discovery of this formal agreement added a crucial piece to Michael and Julia's understanding of royal scandal management as a transnational phenomenon. It wasn't just that similar techniques had been adapted across different monarchical systems. There had been explicit cooperation and coordination between royal households in developing and implementing these techniques. As they worked with the Royal Historical Society team to prepare contextual materials for the public release of these documents, Michael and Julia realized that they had an opportunity to reshape public understanding of how monarchies had functioned as institutions during a critical period of modern history. These documents reveal a dimension of royal power that goes beyond the official diplomatic and political relationships between nations, Michael explained during a presentation to the Society's Governing Council. They show how monarchies cooperated to protect themselves as institutions, recognizing their shared interest in maintaining the mystique and authority of royalty, even as individual royals failed to live up to the ideals they publicly represented. The public release of the Foreign Office records generated considerable media interest, with Michael and Julia giving interviews to major newspapers and appearing on BBC historical programs to provide context and analysis. Their ability to connect these historical revelations to contemporary practices of institutional image management made the story relevant beyond academic circles. During this period of public attention, Michael received a private message from Lord Granville. Professor Bennett, in light of the recent revelations, my family has decided to make additional materials available to appropriate scholars. These include records of my grandmother's participation in the transnational network you've uncovered. If you and Dr. Morales would be willing to treat these materials with the same balance of historical honesty and personal sensitivity you've demonstrated in your previous work, we would be pleased to grant you exclusive access for a defined period. This new collection of private papers provided unprecedented insight into how the transnational royal scandal management network had actually functioned on a day-to-day basis. Lady Elizabeth Hamilton had served as one of the British representatives in this network, maintaining discreet communication with counterparts in other royal households and coordinating responses to potentially damaging situations. Her personal notes documented the network's unwritten rules: never commit sensitive details to official records, maintain plausible alternative explanations for all actions, ensure that financial arrangements cannot be traced to royal treasuries, develop relationships with key figures in press, medicine, and law who can be trusted to prioritize discretion over disclosure. Most revealing were Lady Elizabeth's reflections on the network's underlying purpose. Our work is not merely to conceal individual indiscretions, though that is often the immediate task. It is to preserve the institution of monarchy itself in an age increasingly hostile to hereditary privilege and traditional authority. Each scandal successfully contained is a small victory in the larger battle for the continued relevance and survival of the crown. These materials formed the basis for a new chapter that Michael and Julia added to their book before its final publication, documenting for the first time the existence and operation of this formal transnational network for royal scandal management. Cambridge University Press expedited the production process to include this significant new material, recognizing its historical importance. Beyond Borders, the transnational management of royal scandal was published to even greater acclaim than Michael's first book, receiving praise from historians, political scientists, and media scholars alike. The book's demonstration of how monarchies had cooperated across national boundaries to protect their shared institutional interests offered a new perspective on the resilience of monarchy as a political system in the face of democratic and revolutionary challenges. As the book's reception expanded beyond academic circles, Michael and Julia found themselves increasingly engaged in public discussions about the implications of their historical research for understanding contemporary power structures. They participated in panels on political transparency, institutional accountability, and the evolving relationship between public figures and privacy in the digital age. During one such panel at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, Michael was asked a question that made him reconsider the broader significance of their work. "Professor Bennett, your research shows how monarchies developed sophisticated systems for managing potentially damaging information. Do you see similar systems operating in modern democratic institutions? And if so, what are the implications for democratic accountability?" The question stayed with Michael long after the panel ended. In discussing it with Julia that evening, they realized that their historical research had opened up a new avenue for understanding contemporary power dynamics. The techniques we've documented weren't just about protecting individual royals from embarrassment, Julia observed. They were about preserving institutional power by controlling public perception. Those same imperatives exist in modern institutions, from governments to corporations to religious organizations. And the fundamental tension remains the same, Michael added. How do institutions balance the need for a compelling public narrative that legitimizes their authority with the messy, often contradictory realities of human behavior within those institutions? This conversation led to the outline for their next collaborative project, a comparative analysis of institutional information management across different types of power structures, from historical monarchies to modern democratic governments, global corporations, religious institutions, and celebrity and culture. The project would examine how the techniques pioneered by royal households for managing potentially damaging information had been adapted, refined, and transformed as they were adopted by different types of institutions in different historical and cultural contexts. It would also consider the ethical and political implications of these techniques for transparency, accountability, and the functioning of democratic systems. As they began research for this new project, Michael and Julia received an invitation that would dramatically expand the scope of their work. The Newberry Library in Chicago had acquired the personal papers of Joseph Pulitzer, the newspaper publisher whose pioneering approach to investigative journalism had transformed American media in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Among these papers were materials documenting Pulitzer's attempts to report on scandals involving European royalty visiting the United States and the sophisticated efforts by royal representatives to prevent such reporting. The library's curator believed these materials would be of particular interest given Michael and Julia's research focus. Their examination of the Pulitzer papers revealed a fascinating counterpoint to the royal scandal management systems they had been documenting. Here was the perspective of someone actively working to penetrate those systems, to expose the private realities behind the public facades of royal power. Pulitzer's notes detailed the methods used by royal representatives to discourage reporting on sensitive matters, appeals to patriotism and international relations, subtle threats about access to powerful figures, financial incentives for discretion, and the creation of alternative, less damaging stories to satisfy the public's appetite for royal news. More surprisingly, the papers also revealed instances where Pulitzer had chosen not to publish information about royal indiscretions, not because of external pressure, but based on his own judgment about news value and public interest. His private correspondence suggested a nuanced understanding of the relationship between exposure and accountability, between the public's right to know and the potential consequences of revelation. "This adds a crucial dimension to our understanding," Michael told Julia as they reviewed the materials. "We've been focusing on the institutional mechanisms for containing potentially damaging information, but here we see the other side, the complex calculations made by those with the power to expose such information." Audrey's, the Pulitzer papers led them to expand their research to include the evolving relationship between institutional power and media, examining how royal scandal management techniques had adapted to changing media environments and how those adaptations had influenced broader institutional approaches to information control. This expanded focus attracted the attention of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University, which invited Michael and Julia to spend a semester as visiting scholars, developing their research on the historical relationship between institutional power and media oversight. During their time at Oxford, they organized a workshop bringing together historians, media scholars, political scientists, and practicing journalists to explore these relationships across different time periods and institutional contexts. The workshop generated lively debates about the proper balance between institutional privacy and public accountability, about the role of media in overseeing powerful institutions, and about how digital technology was transforming these long-standing dynamics. One participant, a senior editor at The Guardian, offered a perspective that particularly resonated with Michael. "What fascinates me about your historical research is how it reveals the continuity in these power dynamics, despite enormous changes in technology and social norms." Royal households in the 19th century were managing public perception with the same fundamental goals as modern governments and corporations, maintaining legitimacy by controlling narrative. The techniques have evolved, but the institutional imperatives remain remarkably consistent. This observation crystallized the core insight that had emerged from Michael and Julia's expanding research. Behind the specific techniques of scandal management, behind the varied cultural adaptations across different monarchies and time periods, lay a fundamental pattern of institutional self-preservation through narrative control that transcended historical and cultural boundaries. As they continued to develop this insight through their research and writing, Michael and Julia's personal relationship deepened alongside their professional collaboration. Their shared intellectual passion had blossomed into a partnership that encompassed all aspects of their lives. On a spring evening in the Oxford Botanic Garden, with the historic city spires visible above the ancient trees, Michael proposed marriage, and Julia accepted with characteristic enthusiasm and warmth. They were married in a small ceremony attended by family, close friends, and a surprisingly diverse group of colleagues, historians and archivists who had facilitated their research, scholars from various disciplines who had engaged with their work, even Lord Granville, who had become a friend as well as a research patron. Professor Hayes, who had supported Michael's unconventional research path from the beginning, offered a toast that captured the journey they had taken to Michael and Julia, who began by investigating forgotten royal scandals and ended up illuminating the very nature of institutional power. Their work reminds us that history is not just about documenting what happened in the past, but about understanding the patterns that continue to shape our present. And as they settled into married life and continued their research, Michael and Julia received an unexpected communication from the Swedish Royal Archives. Dr. Lindholm, who had facilitated their research on the Copenhagen incident years earlier, informed them that King Carl XVI Gustaf had personally approved the release of previously restricted materials related to the modern Swedish monarchy's approach to information management. His Majesty believes that greater transparency about historical practices serves the monarchy's contemporary commitment to openness, Dr. Lindholm explained. These materials document how the Swedish royal household's approach to potential scandals evolved from traditional containment to a more modern strategy of managed disclosure during the latter half of the 20th century. This remarkable access to records documenting a monarchy's internal transformation provided Michael and Julia with a case study in how traditional institutions adapt to changing social expectations and media environments. The Swedish material showed a deliberate, staged evolution from the secretive approaches of earlier eras to a more transparent engagement with public interest in royal lives, while still maintaining certain boundaries around privacy. What particularly interested them was evidence that this transformation had not been merely reactive but had involved strategic planning, with the royal household actively anticipating changing public expectations and developing new approaches before external pressure forced them to adapt. It's institutional learning at its most sophisticated, Julia observed as they reviewed the materials in Stockholm. Rather than simply clinging to traditional methods until they became untenable, the Swedish monarchy proactively evolved its approach to maintain relevance and legitimacy in a changing world. Liddy, this insight into institutional adaptation became a central theme in Michael and Julia's new book project, which had evolved from their initial concept into a broader examination of how institutions of all types learn, adapt, and transform their approaches to public perception and information management across changing historical circumstances. Titled The Adaptive Institution: From Royal Secrecy to Modern Transparency, the book traced the evolution of institutional approaches to potentially damaging information from the tightly controlled management systems of 19th century royal households to the more complex, nuanced strategies employed by various types of institutions in the digital age. The book argued that successful institutional adaptation required not just technical changes in communication methods, but fundamental recalibration of the relationship between the institution and its public. Institutions that survived and thrived across changing social and technological environments were those that recognized when traditional approaches to information control had become counterproductive and developed new strategies that balanced legitimate institutional interests with evolving public expectations. The Swedish monarchy provided a primary case study of successful adaptation, but the book also examined other institutions, from the Catholic Church's evolving approach to internal scandals to corporate transformations in response to changing expectations of business transparency to political institutions navigating the tension between necessary confidentiality and democratic accountability. As they completed the manuscript, Michael and Julia received news that would both validate their scholarly approach and create new personal possibilities. Boston University and the University of Massachusetts Boston had jointly created a new center for the study of institutional adaptation, and they were being offered the opportunity to serve as its founding co-directors. The center would bring together scholars from history, political science, media studies, organizational psychology, and other disciplines to examine how institutions of all types adapt to changing environments while maintaining their core functions and legitimacy. It would host visiting scholars, organize conferences, support graduate research, and engage with practitioners from various institutional settings. For Michael and Julia, the center represented an ideal institutional home for their evolving research agenda, allowing them to continue their historical investigations while connecting that work to contemporary applications across different types of institutions. It also provided the stability that made them feel ready to start a family, adding a personal dimension to their partnership that complemented their intellectual collaboration. In the years that followed, as they balanced the demands of academic leadership, ongoing research, and raising their children, Michael and Julia continued to explore the evolving relationship between institutional power and public perception. Their work expanded beyond royal scandal management to encompass a broad range of institutional adaptations across different historical periods and cultural contexts. What remained consistent throughout their evolving research agenda was the core insight that had emerged from Michael's initial investigation into forgotten royal scandals. Behind the public facades of institutional power lie sophisticated systems for managing the tension between idealized narratives and messy human realities, between the myths that sustain authority and the truths that might undermine it. Through their scholarship, teaching, and public engagement, Michael and Julia illuminated these systems not to sensationalize historical scandals or expose institutional vulnerabilities, but to deepen understanding of how power operates across time and cultural boundaries. In doing so, they transformed what had begun as an unconventional research project into a profound exploration of one of the fundamental dynamics of human social organization, the relationship between institutional mythology and lived reality. The strangest royal scandals, carefully buried in restricted archives and private correspondence, had ultimately revealed not just colorful historical anecdotes, but essential truths about how institutions of all kinds navigate the complex relationship between public image and private reality, between the stories they tell about themselves and the often contradictory human experiences that lie beneath those narratives. For Michael Bennett, the journey that had begun with a cryptic reference in a dusty diary had led to insights that transcended historical curiosity to illuminate the very nature of institutional power itself, how it presents itself to the world, how it manages its vulnerabilities, and how it adapts to survive in an ever-changing landscape of human expectations and technological possibilities. As the Center for the Study of Institutional Adaptation flourished under Michael and Julia's leadership, their reputation as pioneering scholars at the intersection of historical analysis and contemporary institutional studies continued to grow. Their center became a hub for interdisciplinary research, attracting visiting scholars from fields ranging from media studies and political science to organizational psychology and cultural anthropology. Their twin daughters, Eleanor and Sophia, born 2 years after the center's founding, grew up in an environment rich with intellectual curiosity. The family's home in a historic Cambridge neighborhood became known for its Sunday afternoon gatherings where academics, journalists, and practitioners from various institutional backgrounds engaged in spirited discussions about power, transparency, and adaptation, while the girls played in the garden or listened from the stairs, absorbing concepts far beyond their years. "They're getting quite an education," Julia remarked one evening after putting the 7-year-old twins to bed. Today, Sophia asked me if the Catholic Church's response to the abuse scandals represented reactive adaptation under external pressure rather than proactive institutional learning. Michael laughed. Clearly your side of the family coming through. My mother says I was still focused on dinosaurs and spaceships at that age. No. Their family life enriched their professional perspective, giving them a more intuitive understanding of how values and narratives are transmitted across generations, a theme that increasingly informed their research on institutional longevity and adaptation. In the fall semester of the twins' 8th year, the center hosted a major international conference on institutional response to digital transparency, bringing together scholars, government officials, corporate executives, and civil society leaders to examine how traditional institutions were adapting to an environment where information control had become increasingly difficult. During the conference planning, Michael and Julia received an unexpected email from Dr. Yuki Tanaka, daughter of Professor Hiroaki Tanaka, who had facilitated their research in Japan years earlier. Dr. Tanaka had followed in her father's footsteps as a historian of the Japanese imperial system, but had expanded her focus to include digital transformation of traditional institutions. I've recently gained access to materials documenting the Japanese Imperial Household Agency's strategic planning during the 1990s and early 2000s, she wrote. These documents reveal a systematic effort to adapt traditional secrecy practices to the emerging internet age, including scenario planning for potential information leaks and digital crises. Given your upcoming conference, I believe these materials would provide a valuable case study in institutional adaptation to digital challenges. This new research opportunity aligned perfectly with the conference theme, and Michael and Julia invited Dr. Tanaka to present her findings as a featured case study. Her research revealed how one of the world's oldest continuous institutions had engaged in sophisticated forward planning to preserve its essential mystique while adapting to a radically changed information environment. What's remarkable about the Imperial Household Agency's approach, Dr. Tanaka explained during her presentation, is how they distinguished between different categories of information and developed specific strategies for each. There were matters they recognized could no longer remain fully private in the digital age, matters where controlled disclosure would be preferable to leaks, and core aspects of imperial tradition they determined must remain protected regardless of technological change. The Japanese case study became a central reference point throughout the conference, providing a concrete example of intentional institutional adaptation that neither rigidly clung to traditional practices nor completely surrendered to new technological realities. As the conference proceedings were being prepared for publication, Michael received an unexpected call from Sebastian Clark, the strategic communications consultant with whom they had collaborated years earlier. Professor Bennett, I've been following the work of your center with great interest, Clark began. Your conference on digital transparency touched on issues that my firm and our clients are grappling with daily. I have a proposition that might interest you and Dr. Morales. Clark explained that his firm had been engaged by a consortium of global institutions, including governmental agencies, multinational corporations, and major cultural organizations, to develop a comprehensive framework for institutional adaptation to the digital transparency environment. The consortium was interested in incorporating historical perspective into this framework and wanted to engage Michael and Julia as academic consultants. They're specifically interested in your work on how institutions have historically navigated transitions in information environments, Clark continued. The parallels between current digital challenges and previous technological disruptions, from the printing press to mass media, provide valuable context for developing adaptive strategies. After careful consideration and consultation with university ethics officials to establish appropriate boundaries, Michael and Julia agreed to a limited consulting arrangement. They would provide historical analysis and theoretical frameworks based on their research, but would not develop specific strategies for individual institutions or be involved in implementing recommendations. This collaboration opened new avenues for their research, giving them unprecedented access to how contemporary institutions were conceptualizing and responding to challenges of digital transparency. It also provided practical applications for their historical analysis, demonstrating how patterns identified in royal scandal management continued to influence institutional adaptation centuries later. What we're seeing is a fundamental recalibration of the relationship between institutions and information, Julia observed during a planning session with Clark's team. Historical precedents suggest that successful adaptation isn't about perfect control, which has become impossible, but about developing new forms of institutional legitimacy that can withstand greater transparency. The consulting project coincided with a significant expansion of the center's research agenda, with substantial new funding from several major foundations interested in institutional trust and transparency. Michael and Julia launched a global comparative study of how different types of institutions across various cultural contexts were adapting to changing information environments. The project, titled Adaptive Authority: Institutional Transformation in the Age of Transparency, employed a team of researchers examining case studies from 6 continents, ranging from traditional monarchies and religious institutions to modern corporations, governmental agencies, and non-profit organizations. What makes this project unique, Michael explained to potential research partners, is its combination of historical depth and contemporary breadth. We're examining how adaptation strategies have evolved over centuries, while comparing how different types of institutions are responding to similar challenges today. As the research progressed, patterns began to emerge that transcended specific institutional types and cultural contexts. Successful adaptation typically involved several key elements, recognizing when traditional information management approaches had become counterproductive, distinguishing between different categories of information requiring different levels of protection, developing proactive disclosure strategies rather than merely reacting to external pressure, and reconceptualizing institutional legitimacy to incorporate values of transparency and accountability without surrendering core institutional functions. The project generated significant academic interest, with preliminary findings presented at conferences around the world and discussed in major policy forums. It also attracted media attention, with Michael and Julia giving interviews to publications ranging from academic journals to mainstream magazines and newspapers. During this period of professional intensity, they worked to maintain balance in their family life, consciously creating space for their daughters amid their demanding schedules. They established firm boundaries around family dinner times and weekend activities, and often incorporated family travel into their research trips, giving Eleanor and Sophia early exposure to different cultures and historical contexts. "We're raising global citizens," Julia remarked during a family trip to Singapore, where they were conducting research on institutional adaptation in Southeast Asian contexts while the twins attended an international school for a semester. They're learning firsthand how institutions function differently across cultural boundaries while maintaining certain universal patterns. As the twins entered their teenage years, showing distinct personalities and interests, Eleanor gravitating towards science and technology, while Sophia showed aptitude for languages and cultural studies, Michael and Julia found their perspectives on institutional transmission of values enriched by their parental experience. The challenge of passing on core principles while allowing for individual adaptation and growth paralleled many of the institutional dynamics they studied professionally. This personal dimension of their research took on unexpected significance when they received an invitation that connected their professional expertise to a deeply personal context. Harvard University was planning a major symposium on family as institution, adaptation and continuity across generations, and the organizers were interested in having Michael and Julia deliver the keynote address, drawing on both their scholarly expertise and their personal experience as parents. "We've never explicitly framed our research in terms of family systems," Michael noted as they discussed the invitation. "But there are fascinating parallels between how families and larger institutions transmit values, manage internal conflicts, adapt to external changes, and maintain continuity across generations. And our experience raising the twins while studying institutional adaptation has certainly informed our perspective," Julia added. "The constant balancing act between maintaining core family values and adapting to the girls' individual needs and changing social contexts mirrors what we see in larger institutions." Their keynote address, titled "The Adaptive Family: Lessons from Institutional History," drew unexpected connections between their historical research on royal households and contemporary family dynamics. They argued that families functioned as micro-institutions with many of the same challenges of maintaining identity while adapting to changing circumstances that larger institutions faced. The symposium led to a new dimension in their research agenda, exploring how patterns of adaptation and continuity manifested across different scales of human organization, from families to global institutions. This scalar approach revealed consistent patterns in how human systems balanced stability and change, tradition and innovation, regardless of their size or specific function. As this research direction developed, Michael received news that brought their work full circle to where it had begun years earlier with Lady Elizabeth Cromwell's diary. The Royal Historical Society was planning a comprehensive digitization of its restricted collections, making previously limited access materials available to qualified researchers worldwide through a secure digital platform. "Given your pioneering work with these collections and your established expertise in analyzing sensitive historical materials, Dr. Chen wrote, the Society would like to invite you to serve on the advisory committee for this project, particularly regarding protocols for researcher access and contextual materials to accompany the digitized documents." Michael and Julia's involvement in this project allowed them to help shape how future scholars would access and interpret the materials that had launched their own research journey. They developed guidelines, emphasizing the importance of contextualizing sensitive historical information, understanding the institutional perspectives represented in the documents, and balancing scholarly openness with respect for privacy considerations even across historical distances. The digitization project coincided with a significant personal milestone, the twins' preparation for college. As Eleanor and Sophia navigated the college application process, Michael and Julia found themselves reflecting on how their own intellectual journey had evolved since Michael's initial curiosity about Lady Elizabeth's cryptic references to the Windsor affair. "It's remarkable to think how that one diary entry led to all this," Michael commented as they reviewed Sophia's application essay for a history program that emphasized institutional analysis. From forgotten royal scandals to a comprehensive theory of institutional adaptation across scales and contexts. And now the girls are developing their own intellectual paths that will take them who knows where, Julia added. Eleanor's interest in how technology transforms institutions and Sophia's focus on cross-cultural institutional comparisons, they're taking elements of our work in entirely new directions. As they helped their daughters prepare for this transition, Michael and Julia also began planning the next phase of their own professional journey. They had been approached about establishing an international consortium of research centers focused on institutional adaptation, with partner institutions in Europe, Asia, and Australia. This would expand the scope and impact of their work while creating new opportunities for collaborative research across cultural boundaries. The prospect of this global expansion coincided with a personal invitation that brought their research journey back to one of its earliest starting points. Lord Granville, now in his 80s but still sharp-minded and engaged with historical scholarship, invited them to spend a sabbatical year as scholars in residence at his family's estate in England, where they would have unrestricted access to the remaining Hamilton family papers that had never been made available to other researchers. "As I approach the end of my stewardship of these materials," Lord Granville wrote, "I believe the time has come for a more comprehensive scholarly assessment of their historical significance. Your balanced approach to sensitive historical information and your broader theoretical framework for understanding institutional adaptation make you the ideal scholars to undertake this work." This invitation offered an opportunity to deepen their understanding of how royal scandal management had functioned at its most intimate level, through the personal perspectives of those directly involved in creating and implementing these systems. It also provided a fitting transitional year as the twins began college, and before Michael and Julia embarked on the establishment of the International Consortium. As they prepared for this next chapter in their personal and professional lives, Michael reflected on the journey that had begun with his curiosity about a cryptic diary entry and evolved into a comprehensive exploration of how human institutions of all types navigate the tension between idealized narratives and complex realities, between tradition and adaptation, between necessary privacy and legitimate transparency. What began as historical curiosity has evolved into something far more universal, he observed to Julia as they walked through the Boston University campus on a crisp autumn day. The twins walking ahead of them engaged in animated conversation about their college plans. "We've discovered patterns in how human systems balance continuity and change that transcend specific historical contexts or institutional types. And in the process, we've created our own evolving institution," Julia replied, nodding toward their daughters. "Transmitting values while adapting to change, maintaining core principles while encouraging innovation, exactly what we study in larger systems." As Eleanor and Sophia turned back toward them, laughing about some shared joke, Michael felt a profound sense of how personal and professional understanding had enriched each other throughout their journey. The study of how institutions adapt and evolve across time had deepened his appreciation for the family they had created, while their experience as parents had enriched their scholarly understanding of institutional dynamics. The strangest royal scandals, carefully concealed in restricted archives and private correspondence, had ultimately led not just to historical discoveries, but to a comprehensive framework for understanding one of the most fundamental challenges facing human organizations of all types: how to maintain essential continuity while adapting to inevitable change. In this framework, Michael and Julia had found not just scholarly significance, but personal meaning, a way of understanding their own lives as part of the larger patterns of human institutional adaptation they had devoted their careers to studying. As they looked toward their sabbatical year in England and the establishment of the International Consortium beyond, they recognized that their research journey, like the institutional processes they studied, would continue to evolve in response to new discoveries, changing circumstances and emerging questions. The story that had begun with forgotten royal scandals had expanded into an exploration of how all human systems navigate the essential tension between preservation and adaptation, between the stories institutions tell about themselves and the complex realities those narratives both conceal and reveal. In the archives of history, in the dynamics of contemporary institutions, and in the intimacy of family life, Michael and Julia had found a universal pattern: the ongoing human effort to create meaning and maintain identity amid constant change. to preserve what is essential while adapting to what is new. It was a pattern that transcended the specific scandals and institutions they had studied to illuminate something fundamental about human social organization itself, and about their own lives as scholars, partners, and parents navigating the same essential challenges they had identified in their research. The journey that had begun in the Boston University Library's archive room had led them around the world and through their own family's growth and development, connecting historical inquiry to contemporary understanding and professional expertise to personal wisdom. And like the institutional adaptations they studied, their journey would continue to evolve, responding to new challenges and opportunities while maintaining the core commitment to understanding that had guided them from the beginning.